I've got 100 subscribers. And it only took me about a year and a half, which I realize is pretty slow channel growth even for other booktubers. But I kind of made a conscious choice to mostly focus on doing full reviews for less talked about books, I guess. So I'm just glad to find out that there's any audience at all for it, and I really do appreciate whatever feedback and views I happen to get. So I thought as sort of a celebration, I would kind of do short reviews for all 23 books that I use in the intro that's at the start of all my videos, which I'm sure all of you watch all the way through every time and you never skip it at all. But let's get away from that and let's get into talking about the actual books. So yeah, the first book I have here is called A Certain Alchemy by Keith Carter. Keith Carter is one of my favorite living photographers. In A Certain Alchemy, he basically compiles works from his past projects during the early 2000s into sort of a best of album. Keith Carter is known to take very mundane places and objects and just imbue them with this sense of magic and wonder, and a lot of his photos are very dark and ominous as well. Like, he uses techniques like tilt shift lenses or very high contrast, or he conceals and reveals different parts of objects to make you look at them in a new way, and in doing that he really immerses you in this very new world with a very strong, solid style. One of my favorite parts in this book, or probably my favorite photographs that he's ever taken, is a series he did of his mother who was in a severe state of dementia. And it's all the more emotionally powerful when you realize that it was his mother who first introduced him to photography. I figure it must have been a way of kind of making peace with grief and loss and things like that. But anyway, Keith Carter is very influential on me and very influential on what kind of images I gravitate towards in my own art. So yeah, I just love the guy, and you should really take some time and just Google his images. Like, I think most people will find something in the photographs that they'll fall in love with. The next book I'm looking at is called Offerings at the Wall, with an introduction by Thomas Allen. Offerings at the Wall is a book that just looks at objects that were left at the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. The introduction talks about the history of the memorial as well as the tradition of leaving objects for fallen Americans in the war. And, you know, any war memorial that was made for the Vietnamese would be, like, at least 6 times as big with all the names on it. Like, the brutality that was inflicted on Vietnam by America is absolutely incalculable. But I think this book is a great way at making the point that everyone who got swept up on either side, they were just normal people. And I get really emotional looking at this book. I mean, I know it's just pictures of objects, but it really gives you all this sense of how objects in our daily lives can become imbued with all this meaning. They can be connected to, like, trauma, they can become pieces of art, pieces of history. And I really especially feel this book pulling at my heartstrings when you look at objects that illustrate all the broken bonds that the war has left in its wake. Pictures of ultrasounds, kids' letters to their dead parents, toys, love letters, things like that. It's a really interesting book, so yeah, pick it up if you ever see it. Next up is this big-ass book on world mythology. I haven't read this whole thing cover to cover. This is the kind of book where you kind of selectively read it and things like that. So, like, I took a trip to Japan a while ago and I read the section on that, and it was really interesting. And of course, I love looking at all the pictures of mythological artwork and relics and, like, ancient ruins and stuff like that. Now, this has quite the Western bias in that, like, Buddhism and Hinduism are listed in here, but Abrahamic religions are not, of course, so, you know, take that bias with a grain of salt. But anyway, I think it's great to have just any book on, like, world mythology like this one, because they're really great at giving you a sort of broad, bite-sized perspective at religious history throughout the world and different times. And it also often ties into things like history and culture, so you're really getting a lot when you read a book like this. So yeah, consider picking up a book on world mythology. They're a lot of fun and you learn a lot. And speaking of mythology, the next book we're looking at is called Tolkien's World, a Bestiary by David Day. Now, I talked about this book a little bit during my review of the Silmarillion, but basically it's an encyclopedia of Tolkien's world from A to Z. So it's got the creatures and the places and even plants all listed out. And it also goes over the timeline of Middle-earth from like the beginning of the universe to like past the Fourth Age. Now, books like this that take the lore of a franchise and just kind of showcase it are really common, so it's kind of taken for granted, but this book came out in 1978, just 1 year after the Silmarillion. So this was the first time that Tolkien fans could see his world laid out and shown off with all of this visual splendor. And there's this really, really unique artwork that you never see anymore when you look at like concept art for Middle-earth or whatever. David Day is a really, really interesting artist in the way that he depicts things, and it gives you sort of a fresh look if you've never seen this book before. It's definitely a must-have for any Tolkien fan out there. Our next book is Icons of Art, the 20th Century, and it's basically one of those books that you find when you're in the gift shop of an art museum, and it's just what it says it is. It looks at famous artworks from the 1900s. Each page spread has like a full-page print of the art on one side and a write-up by a different contributor on the other. And a lot of the write-ups are great, you know, they talk about the artist and their history and like the significance of the artwork and even some of the complex art theory stuff that went into producing the work. But then some of the other write-ups barely do more than describe the artwork. They don't talk about the methods at all, and some of them are flat out inaccurate. Like, there's a page on Robert Rauschenberg, and the artwork that's featured is Canyon, but the book calls it his artwork bed. So the write-up ends up discussing the wrong artwork, which drives me a little bit crazy, but, you know, overall this book does its job of introducing you to a wide variety of artists from the 1900s. Like, there'll be a lot of names that you recognize, but also names of a lot of lesser-known artists that definitely deserve more recognitions. We're finally moving away from coffee table books and getting into night table books. As someone who used to be a huge fan of Stephen King, I couldn't go without including one of his books in my intro. So I have here a lovely first edition of Pet Sematary, which is considered one of his better horror novels, and as someone who's sort of fallen out of love with Stephen King, I can safely say that Pet Sematary is one of the few of his novels that still hold up really well for me. So the book is about a family who moves into a rural town very close to a pet cemetery, but a man lives across the road who seems to know a little bit more about the cemetery than meets the eye, and once the father of the family finds out what's really going on, he becomes obsessed. Now, Stephen King claims that when he wrote this story, he scared himself so bad with it that he tucked it away in a drawer and swore never to publish it, until he got convinced by an agent, or I don't know. Now, obviously that story is bullshit, because what horror author would not want to publish a novel for being too scary? But it goes some way to illustrating the sort of reputation this book has, and even if you're someone like me who doesn't get scared by what they read in books, this book is still a really interesting examination of like mourning and people grappling with mortality and loss and stuff like that. And it's also one of the few Stephen King novels that has a pretty well written ending. So if you have never read anything by Stephen King, I often recommend Pet Sematary as a great place to start with him. Our next book takes us all the way back to the writings of ancient Rome. It's called the Aeneid by Virgil, and during the early imperial period, the Emperor Augustus commissioned Virgil to write this epic retelling of the mythological founding of Rome. It was my first taste of ancient Roman writing, and I absolutely loved it. Like, the fall of Troy, the journey through the underworld, and the epic battles at the end. It's just so awesome all the way through. And there's a lot of things like references that kind of will probably go over your head as you're reading, but unlike other ancient Roman writings that I've read, it's fine if you don't get the references, because the story is so easy to follow and accessible. And if you've read the Iliad and the Odyssey, this is a great third book because it basically takes an alternate perspective on those same stories. So yeah, I think this is a great place to start if you've never read an ancient Roman writing before, and maybe you want to start with Homer, but after that, by all means, go straight to Virgil. Like, I think it's a lot easier to read than a lot of people give it credit for. Yeah. The next book we're looking at is called Commonwealth by Martin Large, which is a political theory book that focuses on something called social threefolding, which is this idea that in order to have a progressive and equitable and sustainable society, it needs to balance between the government, the economy, and culture. So the book starts off with Martin Large going into detail on what that means, and then he uses stories from around the UK to kind of illustrate what needs to be done. So he'll look at how bad privatization of certain sectors is, like public health, transportation, things like that, and then he'll contrast it with what's being done to curtail like the rising cost of living or inflation or pollution or what have you. Like, he talks about food cooperatives and land-based trusts, and he talks about universal basic income. So this book introduced me to a lot of concepts and problems that I wasn't really aware of in society, and really sort of helped shape my political thinking in some ways. Although I will say all of the in-depth economic talk that this book goes through went like right over my head. This book presumes a fair amount of knowledge. The other thing is that Martin Large makes a few arguments without any citations, which is a little bit of a problem. And then he also makes a few false equivocations. But for the most part, it's very academically sound, and it's definitely worth reading if you're looking for a political theory book that doesn't explicitly conform to, like, right-wing versus left-wing. Definitely look into it if you're curious. Maybe you won't find this particular book, but I still think social threefolding is worth looking into. We've got another political book for you here. It's called Parting the Waters by Taylor Branch. This is the first volume in a 3-volume huge series about Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. The first book, which I think is by far the best in the series, covers like before Martin Luther King was born to the March on Washington. And it's just brimming with so much detail and depth. Like, it never shies away from the absolute brutality that was racism and segregation. The other thing it doesn't shy away from is Martin Luther King's politics, which were not only progressive, but often radical, and so much of that is often whitewashed and forgotten about today. The other thing is, this book is not just about Martin Luther King. It also talks about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It talks about Malcolm X in the later books, and the Black Panthers, and the Vietnam War, and how that tied into civil rights. Like, this book is everything in the kitchen sink, and it's only volume 1. So I don't know if I'd recommend it as a starting point if you aren't familiar with the civil rights movement. I'd probably tell you to start with, like, the Eyes on the Prize documentary series instead. But once you feel comfortable, you can't miss this. It's an absolute beast of a biography series. Here's another Pulitzer Prize-winning biography about a man who changed the landscape of America during the 20th century. But this time, the man in question is incredibly, brutal and nihilistic and power-obsessed. The book is called The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York by Robert Caro. And it's a 1,400-page book about an urban planner. And I know you're probably thinking, that sounds a little boring, but let me tell you, this book is a hell of a ride. So what Robert Moses wanted to do is basically clean up the congestion in New York City and modernize it. He wanted to promote meritocracy and do away with corruption in the city government. But you get early warning signs that this guy should not be handed power under any circumstances, and as the book goes, he gets more and more power and wields it with more and more brutality. He displaced hundreds of thousands of people in his lifetime because of his plans. He absolutely annihilated countless neighborhoods that were either low income or neighborhoods of color. He ghettoized people and forced them into some of the worst public housing units in the country's history, and what he did in New York has been copied in numerous American cities. So this book is a really great way of looking at just how sadistic the power structures can be. It's like a train wreck in slow motion, like you can't look away from it. So if you're feeling strong and you want like a big biography to sink your teeth into, I highly recommend The Power Broker for sure. The next book from my intro is this edition of The Fiddlehead. The Fiddlehead is Canada's oldest consistently running literary journal. It's published quarterly and it features short stories, poetry, and literary reviews by new and established writers. I used to really want to be a published author when I was a kid, so when I was in high school, I bought a lot of copies of this and I read the short stories a lot. They really inspired me, and if you're like someone who wants to be a writer yourself, I highly recommend getting some copies of different literary journals and magazines, because not only can it really show you the strength of short stories, but short stories are often sort of the gateway for a lot of authors to get their names published and get their names out there and stuff like that. I used to submit to this a lot, and my writing wasn't good enough for them. But a few years ago, I kind of realized that, the Fiddlehead takes artwork too, because they need different artists for all of their covers. So I submitted this photograph, and they ended up putting it on the cover of this edition, which I'm super proud about, and I also got my drawings published inside of another edition of the Fiddlehead, so I may not have made it as a writer, but I guess I'm doing okay as an artist. But I'm kind of rambling. Basically, my point is, if you're interested in being a writer or short stories, then you definitely need to pick up some literary journals and magazines. They're definitely worth keeping an eye on. I've got another art book here for you. This one is called David by Simon Lee, and it focuses on Jacques-Louis David, who was one of the greatest French painters of all time. You might recognize him for The Death of Marat, The Death of Socrates, or this painting of Napoleon on the horse that he did. Jacques-Louis David is probably one of the best artists you can write a biography on, because his life was crazy turbulent. So this book is not only an art book, but it's also a biography, and it goes through his whole life, and it's meant to be read from cover to cover. So Jacques-Louis David lived through the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon and the restoration of the monarchy, yet he always managed to cozy up to the people whose power and significance was on the rise, and barely escaped with his life in multiple situations. And he used a lot of very manipulative Machiavellian little tactics to keep himself at the top of the art world despite all the changings of the guard. You see him grappling with how to become the best and how to make the best compositions and how to plan out his gigantic paintings. I've seen them at the Louvre. They're like building-sized paintings. It's insane, but anyway. The other thing is that this book gets pretty deep into the art theory and neoclassicism and the art movements that David was instrumental in forming. If you're interested in art history and art biographies, this is one to keep on your radar for sure. People watching my channel might recognize this old friend here because I did a full review on it a while back. The book is The Godfather by Mario Puzo. This is undoubtedly the most famous mafia story ever. It was written at a time where Mario Puzo was split between writing short stories for pulpy men's magazines and trying his hand at more highbrow literary fiction. And you can definitely tell that when you're reading this. The main story focuses on the Corleone crime family. There's a multi-million drug deal that comes their way and they turn it down, but the other families get involved trying to make sure this deal goes smoothly and get in on it, and everyone ends up getting involved. Things get very explosive and violent, and Michael Corleone, the son of the Corleone crime family, gets wrapped up into things too, even though he doesn't want anything to do with the mafia. This book has a lot of really interesting, deeper themes relating to, like, the corruption of our institutions and criticizing, like, the American dream and manifest destiny and all those things. But like I said, there's a lot of pulpiness in here too, and the writing can be pretty rough around the edges in places. I definitely prefer the movie, but I think the book does a better job at handling Michael's character. So yeah, this one's a classic for crime novels, so if you have any interest in stuff like that, by all means check it out. Here's another familiar face. This is A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, and when I did my full review on this, I was really surprised to see that it ended up being like my second most viewed video, especially since this is a book from the 70s about what the 1300s were like in England and France. I guess I'm just glad to see that such a niche subject can still get me some attention. But yeah, so the 1300s was an incredibly turbulent century. You had the peasant revolts, you had the Black Plague, the Papal Schism, the 100 Years' War, and a crusade. So, like, everything is happening in this book, and as much as I enjoyed it, unfortunately, it's hard to keep track of all that stuff, so I've forgotten quite a few of the details. But I still come away knowing, like, how to characterize the 1300s in my mind. Now, Barbara Tuchman is very aware that she's dealing with an unwieldy subject, and sometimes that works against the book quite a bit, but for the most part she's great at making everything accessible and entertaining. Like, my favorite chapters were the parts that talked about, like, the Black Plague and domestic life, and, like, the end Battle of Nicopolis was great. So yeah, if you're interested in medieval history, then this is a good book to read for sure. I bet you thought we were all done with the art books, didn't you? But this is the last art book we're going to be looking at. It's called Le Temps du Sommeil by Francis Alys, and I'm sure I butchered the pronunciation. Francis Alys is an artist based in Mexico who mostly does performance art, but in 1996 he started a series of very small paintings that are loosely based on performance, but I saw them in New York in 2011 and they were so much more than that. Like, all the paintings are so dreamlike and weird and vaguely ominous, and I was really into that kind of thing when I was in high school, so like, the paintings really stuck in my memory, and years later I happened across this book that has all of the paintings printed at actual size, so you get a good sense of the scale when you're holding this book in your hands. The paintings have a very cult kind of vibe to them. Everybody's faceless, there's like these recurring motifs that you spot over and over again. It's almost like a story that you can't quite make sense of. I don't know if I can really recommend this book to anybody, but I don't know what to say, I just love it. The next book we're looking at is by one of my favorite authors. This is The Wayward Bus by John Steinbeck. Now, this isn't exactly my favorite novel of John Steinbeck's, but just look at this vintage cover. Like, this is an edition from the year this book came out, so I just had to include it in my intro. The book is about a guy who lives out in the middle of nowhere, and he runs a private bus that goes from town to town, and the book follows one of his routes. And over the course of the book, you get to know all of the passengers and their backstories. All of the characters are, about to embark on a big new chapter in their lives. And the guy who operates the bus, although his life is very routine in comparison, is kind of confronted by all these characters over the course of the book and begins to look at his own life and wonder if he feels fulfilled and what is he going to do now that he's in, like, the last half of his life or whatever. So it's a very sort of introspective book. It's one of Steinbeck's, like, small scale novels, so you can compare it to Cannery Row, for example. Although this one is off the beaten path, it's not one of his more talked about books, I'd say from what I remember that it really holds its own with some of his bigger titles. So if you're curious, yeah, like, this is a book that I think is worth your time for sure. We're moving on from one of my favorite authors to one of my favorite novels, which also has some of the best prose I've ever read. The book is called The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. It follows Esther Greenwood, who is a fashion journalist in New York City, and in spite of living her dreams, she's incredibly depressed. Over the course of the book, her mental illness gets worse and worse, and her narration gets less and less reliable. Now, this book has come under scrutiny recently for being quite problematic. Esther is extremely judgmental, she's anxious all the time, and she's also quite bigoted. But I think there's intention behind Plath making her that way. Esther has clearly internalized a lot of the most toxic standards of beauty and behavior from her fashion writing, and uses it to attack herself just as often as she attacks other people. I also think it's a way of showcasing her paranoia and her way of walling herself off from everybody by judging them in the most shallow ways possible. And I don't want to suggest that this is just a nihilistic book all the way through. Sylvia Plath has a very razor-sharp wit. There's a lot of nihilistic humor throughout the book, and her prose is just so engaging, and her character writing so strong that you can't help but just get sucked right into it, even though Esther is a very caustic character to follow. If you do pick up this book, which I highly recommend, obviously, I urge you to try and look past the more problematic aspects to see what a masterpiece this book is underneath. Another classic from my intro is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. For anyone who wants to read classics but is maybe a little intimidated, I usually recommend this as the perfect place to start. Harper Lee's writing is incredibly accessible, you'll just fall right into it. Whether you're a teenager or an adult, you'll get a lot out of this book. Yes, this book is obviously about racism and the search for equal justice, but it's a lot more than just a good versus evil story. Harper Lee addresses a lot of gray areas. For example, Atticus Finch, the lawyer, is on the side of justice, but he clearly benefits a lot from the status quo as well. There's also a lot of social tension going on. The adults in this book are obsessed with propriety and tradition, and they would rather attack one another and different marginalized communities rather than work together. And Scout, the young girl in this book, has to sort of grapple with the fact that her idealized white picket fence kind of life is a lot more complicated and a lot darker than it seems just beneath the surface. So there's a lot of humor and a lot of wit in this book as well. It's just a really, really beautiful novel, and if you haven't read it yet, you absolutely need to. The next book I'm looking at is The Orange Eats Creeps by Grace Krilanovich. This is a very bizarre surrealist novel that isn't very story or character oriented. Rather, your enjoyment for this book is going to come almost entirely from whether or not you can get into the absolutely schizophrenic writing style. So the story is about a homeless drug addict girl who is trying to find her runaway foster sister along what she calls the highway that eats people. She hallucinates, she dreams, she has flashbacks, all without really telling you. So you're constantly disoriented, you're not sure what's real or not, and it just goes on from there as this character stumbles through various hallucinogenic fugue states trying to keep her mind on the goal of finding this person. I wish that it was a little bit more literal in discussing the story, but I realize this book is about tearing apart conventional storytelling, so I guess I understand it. And although this book is going to frustrate most readers and it can feel like a mess at times, I still just love it for how atmospheric and weird it is. Krilanovich is able to make the most mundane places seem completely post-apocalyptic. She also has a really good sense of humor. The book is surprisingly funny at points, and it's just a complete trip. I think a lot of people are going to dismiss books like this, but I can't help it. I just love it. This next book is pretty crazy as well. It's Hellsing by Kohta Hirano. Hellsing is a 10-volume manga series that is super violent, action-packed. I absolutely loved this when I was an edgy teenager. So it's about a policewoman named Sarah's Victoria who is shot, and in order to save her life, she decides to become a vampire. It's a long story, but anyway, she gets taken in by the Hellsing organization, who exists to fight demonic creatures. It just gets so crazy so fast as Sarah's Victoria learns about her new powers and becomes stronger and stronger. You've got Nazi zombies that invade England. You've got the Vatican sending out killer nuns and killer priests that join the fray. And it never takes itself too seriously, so there's a lot of humor, especially around just the absurdity of the premise. It's not exactly a masterpiece by any means, but it's a lot of fun, and it still has a pretty special place in my heart. Okay, we've come to the mass market paperback, so that must mean we're getting close to the end here. This is 2001, A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. Now, most people have already heard of the movie, so they naturally assume that it's based on this book. But that's not actually the case. The movie and book were created at the same time as one another, and the book is based off of early drafts of the script for the movie. Arthur C. Clarke said that he felt like quite a minor cog in the process here, and you really get that sense when you read this because it feels like a very shallow shadow of the movie. The one advantage that it has is that it expounds on the hard science involved in the story. For example, it talks about the slingshot effect, which was this technique for exploring space, which was only theoretical when this book came out, but is now used in most of NASA's space missions. But yeah, overall, as much as I like the story of Space Odyssey, this just doesn't quite capture how enigmatic the movie is. It's like one of those very literal novelizations of a Hollywood film that you would pick up at an airport or something, you know? So, in terms of science fiction, if you're looking for one that's really worth your time, in my opinion, then I would recommend Solaris by Stanisław Lem. I just don't happen to own a copy of that, so this is my science fiction stand-in from my intro. Next we have Silverwing by Kenneth Oppel. So a little before I started my channel, I went back and revisited all these books from my childhood, and I was surprised at how many deeper themes that were in those books that I could only pick out as an adult. Silverwing was definitely one of those cases. It's about a runt bat named Shade who gets separated from his colony during the winter migration. He bumps into an outcast bat named Marina, and together they decide to rejoin Shade's colony. They have to face dangerous predators, hostile landscapes, they run into all kinds of memorable characters along the way, and there's a lot of action and suspense. When I was a kid, that's all I needed, but as an adult, there's still a lot that I could sink my teeth into. So Shade, being a runt, has a bit of an inferiority complex. He's eager to prove himself and a little bit arrogant. He also has this belief system that comes from his colony, and as he meets other characters, that belief system is constantly being challenged, and he's having to reassess how he views the world and his place in it. He's constantly having to parse out right from wrong, or the truth from deception. So those are some pretty mature themes for a kid's book, and obviously it's a little bit religious in tone, but it's never preachy, it's never overbearing, it's handled in a very decent way, and it's surprising at just how much I connected to it as an adult. The other two books in the trilogy are excellent as well, so this is definitely a more overlooked children's series, but it's worth looking into for sure. I would liken it to Watership Down. And last but not least, we have The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. This is another book that I've done a full review on, and it's a fantasy novel from the 1920s, which is about this war between Witchland and Demonland. The war is sort of strung along by the manipulative Lord Grow and the demon Ouroboros. It's a very satirical sort of book. It's extremely deconstructive considering the time it was written. All the manly men characters are obsessed with martial virtues, and they see war as a means unto itself, basically. It's a really good indicator of the mood that Edison was in after World War I, because, there were all these promises of oh, that was the war to end all wars, we'll never fight again. But E.R. Edison depicts violence as intrinsic to human nature, that history repeats itself and that we're trapped in this cycle of violence all the time. And he parallels the cycle of violence with the cycle of nature. And also there's a lot of women characters in this who have a surprising amount of agency for the time this was written. And they are constantly criticizing and deconstructing the men and their pig-headed behavior in the book. My one thing that I would caution readers on who go into this is that the writing is not exactly accessible. Edison writes in a antiquated medieval sort of way, so that's a little hard to wrap your head around, but I learned a lot of new words, if that makes you any more interested to read it. So yeah, this is often overlooked, but hopefully it gets a little bit more recognition going forward, because this is certainly a fantasy novel that is worth your time. Whew. Okay, that's it. I've made it through all 23 of the books from my intro, given them a short little review and discussion, and now that I look at this pile, I'm beginning to think that I bit off a little bit more than I could chew with this video. But hey, maybe I've given you a few books to think about reading that weren't on your radar before. And if that's the case, I'd love to hear which of these sort of grabbed your attention the most. If there's any of these that you think I should do like a full review video on, let me know that as well, because I could definitely see going into more depth with some of these. But I guess that'll have to do it. Thank you all again for 100 subscribers. That really does mean a lot to me. I know I don't upload very often, but I can promise that I will be back eventually to talk to you about more books, so I guess stay tuned for that. Yeah. Now, which one of you wants to help me put these back?